Good afternoon. On behalf of the Criminal Law Society, I want to say thank you for joining us today as we discuss government service, FBI investigations, leadership, and institutional integrity. My name is Josh Luger, and I'm a 2L here at BC Law and the Vice President of the Criminal Law Society. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce the guest joining us today, former FBI Director James Comey. Director Comey has had an incredible career in public service as an AUSA in New York and Virginia, the United States Attorney in Manhattan, Deputy Attorney General at the Department of Justice, and ultimately the Director of the FBI. He has also held various roles in the private sector throughout his career. Since leaving the FBI, Director Comey has written 2 books about his career in public service, including his most recent book, Saving Justice, which current students have received as part of today's event. On a personal level, as an employee of the Bureau during Director Comey's tenure, I want to say that he inspired a culture at the Bureau that both demanded excellence and helped this large law enforcement agency feel like a family. Director Comey was a champion of all who worked for the Bureau, working to create a more diverse FBI and an agency that was focused on a set of core values that were easy to understand, but essential to live up to.
Thank you, Josh, for that intro. And thank you again, Director Comey. Thank you, everyone in attendance. I now have the pleasure of introducing our moderator for this event. We're honored to have Dean Rougeau himself here to help us with that. For those of you, I know most of you are familiar with him, but for those who are not, Dean Rougeau has served in his position since 2011. He previously served as a professor of law at Notre Dame and served as their associate dean for academic affairs until 2002. He graduated magna cum laude from Brown University and earned his JD from Harvard in 1988, where he served as the articles editor for the Harvard Human Rights Journal. Dean Rougeau has written, spoken, and led several organizations focused on legal education reform, including the Executive Committee of American Association of Law Schools, where he also served as chair of the AALS Dean Steering Committee and the Council of Boston Bar Association. His efforts have included a more holistic approach to student services and expanding the school's national and international recruitment of a diverse student body. Before entering the academy, he practiced law at the Washington, D.C. office of Morrison and Foster from 1988 to 1991. Recently, Dean Rougeau has accepted a position as president of the College of the Holy Cross. We hope he'll join us in congratulating on that. Dean Rougeau.
Well, thank you so much, Matt, and good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you today, and my special thanks and welcome to Director Comey for joining us. So with that, I'd let the Director Comey make a few remarks.
Great. Thank you, Dean. Thank you all for having me here today. Josh, it seems like yesterday I was presenting you your credentials at a graduation at FBI. I think I was taller than, you look about the same. The beard is awesome though. I just want to speak very, very briefly and do 2 things. First, tell you I'm sorry, and second, tell you I'm incredibly optimistic. First, to all the students who are watching, I'm sorry that your law school experience involves this. I so wish I could be with you. I so wish I could see you on the other side, as they say in Hamilton. And I regret that you're feeling the anxiety and the pain and all the things that come with this time of life, this incredible period. And I know all of you are suffering in different ways, and I wish I could say something that would be useful to you, but I can't, except I'm sorry. I envy you in a way because of my optimism. As dark as this time is, you are about to step into the life of a lawyer at an inflection point in our country. I think our country is about to experience a period of growth and productivity and excitement that we really haven't experienced since the decade after the last pandemic. The decade of the 1920s was a remarkable period of growth for Americans of all kinds, an incredible opportunity. Now, it ended in 1929 with our excesses being paid for, but I'm optimistic we'll be smarter this time around, and you are going to step into a world that couldn't be more exciting. And it's also kind of screwed up. We grown-ups have definitely screwed it up. Great, fix it. Step into the life of this country and into this world and make it better. You are uniquely equipped by virtue of your education. And I know what a pain in the neck it is to get that education through Zoom, but you are uniquely equipped to make a difference in the life of this country and to drive that period of growth even higher and in more exciting ways. I often speak to younger audiences than this and urge them to remember something that Albert Einstein said. Try not to become people of success. Try to become people of value. That is, the hard thing about being a talented person, and if you're on this Zoom, you're a talented person, is that you can often be distracted by and lured towards the markers of success. How do I get a bigger this? How do I get a bigger that? How do I get recognized for this thing or that thing? And that's okay. I mean, that's healthy unless it becomes everything to you, unless success becomes who you want to be and how you will measure yourselves, because it's different from value. Value is not about the things you accumulate. It's about the difference you make in the world and in the people around you. I hope you'll try to be that kind of person. I guarantee you at the end of this short life, you are not going to look back on the things, the plaques, the beautiful cars you had. You're going to look back on the difference I made in the lives of people who needed me. And so I hope you will become people of value, because our country needs that very, very much now in all kinds of ways. And I'm sure we'll talk about some of them. Justice, law enforcement, the intersection between communities of color, especially the Black community in America, and our government, and especially our law enforcement communities. We need to be better in all kinds of ways, and we need smart people who want to be people of value to help us get there. And the good news is, I think you are uniquely equipped by the education you're getting now to be those people of value. When I think about the people I admired, the people I love being led by, and the way I've tried to be as a leader, I think back to a lot of the things I learned in law school. Law school was, in a lot of ways for me, a nightmare, but it made me a better thinker, and I think a better leader. It forced me to see the world through the eyes of others, because I was constantly being asked in class, as you are, take the other side of that argument. Okay, so your colleague has said A, make the case for not A. What would you say? How would you see it? What if I changed this fact or that fact? What if the holding were slightly different? How would the world be different? How would your argument be different? And you may not realize it in the moment, but what your professor is forcing you to do is orbit a situation, circle it in your mind, and see it in different ways. Because the challenge of being me is I'm trapped in me. I'm a 6'8" awkward white guy from the New York metropolitan area. Okay, that's great in some ways, but incredibly limiting in other ways, because I'm only me. I can only experience the world, think about facts, arguments, perspectives as me. I get better when I have help, when I'm able to, with the assistance of others, orbit a situation and see it differently. That's the essence of judgment. And that's what you're practicing now in law school. You're forced to take the other side, to see it differently. Treasure that, as painful as it can be, because it will help you be a better person and a better leader. Another thing you're learning in law school right now is how to work with others, how to harness their brain power, their perspectives, their take, their work ethic to make your own better. Being forced to accept the feedback of others. One of the painful things about Zoom world is that your classmates don't get to follow you out to a cup of coffee and tell you that what you just said was a bunch of crap. I hope you get that from the people who love you, who will have a Zoom chat with you and tell you, oh, some crazy stuff you just said. What they're teaching you is the value of those up-close perspectives that teams build. And the last thing I think you're learning in law school that will be priceless is you're constantly being asked to lift your eyes above the current controversy, above the current case, and asked, so what are the principles here? What are the things that we draw from this situation that are lasting? What are the things that should guide us? And I hope, and I know, given where you are in law school, that you're also internalizing the values at the core of this nation, our Constitution, a commitment to the rule of law, to justice being blindfolded. Those things are all imperfect. We're never quite where we aspire to be, but you're internalizing the idea that there are standards, there is a framework, there are North Stars that you ought to be looking up to as you make decisions. You're forced to look up to those things, to find them and to rely upon them. That is really going to help you, because you're going to be in jobs, in institutions where people are angry and they're tired and they're hungry and they're telling you that everyone's going to be pissed at you if you make a certain decision. And I just want to get out of this situation, so I'll just do what the crowd wants me to do, except you won't, because you've learned to lift your eyes. You will lift your eyes above that storm, above the urgent and the angry and the tired and the hungry and the popular, and ask, so what should guide this decision? What are the principles at stake here? What are the things that will make this a decision that I'll want to brag about someday, that I made it in a quality way? Believe it or not, you are preparing for those moments now. Treasure that, because you will look back on it, you will draw upon it when you are led, and especially when you are leading and trying to make very difficult decisions. So thank you for being on this call today. If you want to hear what I say, I'm hoping you're somebody who's thinking about finding ways to use your talents to serve others. I hope you'll do that. We need you, and I'm optimistic about the future of this country because of people like you. You will make us better. You will be people of value. And now I look forward to our conversation.
Thanks so much, Director Comey. I have to say those were really stirring words for all of us in legal education, all of us who are law students or who are legal professionals. And it reminds us just how important the work that we all do is to our country, our democracy, and to ourselves as individuals, and what's at stake when we make decisions throughout our careers. So you've taken some time to be with us today, and I want to go through a number of topics that I know will be of interest to our audience and are in areas that where you know quite a bit. And I thought we could start with your recent book, Saving Justice. And your book reads largely as a compelling intuitional memoir from the vantage point of one of the most important public officials in recent history. In your experience working in that position, your most recent position, and within other institutions that are heavily populated by lawyers, do you see the same public service compulsions that you talked about in your book, and this metaphor that you used of the reservoir? Do you see those things as also being applicable there? And I guess you might want to talk a little bit about that metaphor that you raised in the book for the audience.
No, thank you. Thank you for that, Dean. First of all, I was never going to write a first book, no less a second book about government. And I wrote the first book because I was hoping to be useful in teaching people about leadership, really tricking them into learning about leadership through a story-driven book. As I watched damage being done to the Department of Justice over the last 4 years, it occurred to me that I could be useful by telling some more stories to try to illustrate just what are the values at the core of justice. How do you learn about them, and why do they matter, and how have they been hurt in the last few years? And so I hope it's a fun book to read. I really hope, especially people who are lawyers in training or think about being lawyers, will read it. It's a quick read because it's aimed at just trying to illustrate a core set of things. And the most important thing it illustrates is that institutions, especially institutions of justice, depend upon the trust of the people they serve and represent. And I describe the trust in the book as a reservoir of trust and credibility. I used to, when I was U.S. Attorney in New York, I lived near a reservoir, which is why this popped into my head. And it occurred to me that reservoirs take forever to build and to fill, but they can be destroyed by a single person putting a hole in the dam. And that was useful to me because the way I think about institutional trust is it's built by people telling the truth, people making promises and keeping them, people making mistakes, as all people do, and admitting them. And that accumulation over years and years and years and years of truths told, promises kept, mistakes admitted, fills a reservoir of trust and credibility. And that it can be drained by the lies, the dishonesty, the deceit, the misbehavior of a single person. So in an institution, each of you in that institution is, in a real way, the guardian entirely of that reservoir, because you could kill it. And it was filled by people you never met. But your job is to protect it and pass it on to those who follow you as full as you got it, maybe even more full than when you got it. And I think that's uniquely true of institutions that, like a justice institution that relies upon the public believing what investigative agents, for example, say at a doorway, or when they speak in front of a jury, or representations that a lawyer makes to an appellate court. But I believe it's true of all institutions, that every institution of any long standing has a reputation that has helped it remain long-standing. It's trusted to keep its promises. When it reports its numbers to the Securities and Exchange Commission, it tells the truth. When it enters a contract, it abides its word. When it tells employees you'll be treated in a certain way, they are treated in that way. And when they're not, there's hell to pay for those who mistreated employees. Those are the ways in which even non-justice institutions rely upon a reservoir of trust and credibility. And the job of people in that institution, especially in the role of lawyers, is to be guardians of that institution and to constantly think as they're making decisions, how does this tether to this institution's values? Remember that I talked about that lifting of the eyes. Every time you make a decision as a lawyer, advising a client or making a decision on your own, if you're acting in a non-legal way, you ought to be lifting your eyes and saying, is this consistent with the values of this institution? Is this going to be one I'll be proud to have people talk about someday? Or is this going to risk the reservoir? I used to teach my lawyers when I was a general counsel at 2 different companies between government stints that to my mind, the phrase that for 2 phrases capture a lawyer's obligation. Yes, when it can be, semicolon, no, when it must be. The yes, when it can be part is to capture the idea that a lawyer working with an institution is supposed to be helping that institution achieve its lawful goals. Don't become someone who just says no all the time. Ask your clients, what is it you're trying to accomplish? Oh, okay, I get it. I can now help you get to that place in a good way. That's the yes when it can be. The no when it must be reflects that there are going to be times when where they want to go is a place you just can't go. That it's a place that's improper, that's unlawful, that's just unacceptable. And the lawyer has to be somebody who understands that that right side of the semicolon is a sworn obligation. That just because you say yes most of the time doesn't mean there aren't going to be times when you say not only no, but hell no. We can't go there ever. And I will stand here and you'll have to run me over to get to that place because I serve an institution that depends upon us thinking for the long term and thinking about its values. So whether you're in a justice institution or you're at a motor company or insurance company, you're going to encounter similar situations where you have to think about this institution and its reservoir of trust and find ways to protect it.
Thanks so much. So I really appreciated hearing what you had to say about trust and about institutional trust. And I know you discussed how the trust of the Department of Justice was so important. Well, institutional trust in the Department of Justice was so important in helping that institution deal with volatile situations at both the national level and with individuals. But what you just said also reminded me of the importance of interpersonal skills for a lawyer, not only in terms of handling critical situations, legal situations, but also really handling clients and witnesses and other human beings with whom they deal. So as our students in particular are developing their legal expertise, what would you like to say to them about how they retain those core aspects of their humanity, which really allow them to be effective interpersonally? How important are those interpersonal skills to the work that lawyers do?
I think they're essential. That successful lawyers, no matter what specialty of law they go into, are people who are students of people and think well and hard about what are people like, and have internalized the advice that my amazing wife, I think, started giving me when we were dating, which is, it's not about you, dear. And what she meant in most situations by that is, whatever people are feeling, emoting, expressing, it's not about you. They're having a day. They have an experience. They have a sick relative. They have a pet that needs surgery. There's something going on in their life that has nothing to do with you. And as I alluded to earlier, the central challenge of human existence is, I don't think that instinctively. I think that I shape the world, right? Everything happens because of me. I'm sitting here in this thing thinking that I am the one making the weather all around me. Well, the challenge is every one of us is thinking the exact same thing. All of us think we are shaping the weather for everybody else, when it turns out really none of that is true. Starting there and understanding people is the key to being an effective advocate, counselor, friend, spouse, I think. understanding that people are seeing the world and experiencing it differently than you are is at the core of being effective at anything, but especially as a lawyer. And the second thing, realizing that we share a common experience. We're all afraid. Every human being is afraid. We're afraid of our physical insecurities. We're afraid of illness. We're afraid of economic insecurity. We're afraid of what might happen to our parents. We're afraid. There is fear at the center of most of human experience. We're afraid that we don't understand life's meaning. We're afraid that we may not be as important as we'd like to be. Well, understanding that about people and trying to use that as an engine for the development of empathy, a sense of feeling and connection for other people, is also at the heart of being an effective advocate and also an effective spouse and partner. And so I used to try and discipline myself to try and develop some of these skills by sitting in rooms around conference tables when it wasn't my turn to speak, and trying to go around the room and see if I could try to imagine what the others were experiencing. Could I tell from their body language, what they had said, how are they doing? What are they worried about? What are they bringing into this room? And obviously I couldn't fully know, but just the exercise of being disciplined about trying to figure that out helped me internalize that, so that as I got older and more senior leadership positions, I would walk into a room and just instinctively look around the room and try and understand, where are the others coming from? Because they are coming surely from a different place than I am. And then the last thing is, as a leader, you need to recognize that there's an imbalance between you and the people you lead. They're afraid of you. And in different organizations, the fear is lesser or greater, but every time there is a lead and there is a leader, there's an upslope to the leader. And don't give me this nonsense about, no, I work in a software company where we sit on beanbag chairs and eat M&Ms and draw on whiteboards and we're all the same. No, you're not. If someone is a stockholder and owns more stock than the other, someone is a founder, the earth slopes up towards them in a way it doesn't slope up towards you. There's an imbalance. The leader's job is to recognize that that exists and that it has an impact on the way people communicate. It makes it harder for a leader to hear the truth, and understanding that people fear exposure. I often talk about the imposter complex, right? That's the idea that if you really knew me the way I know me, you would think less of me. I guarantee it. Now, I think all humans have that to one degree or another. If you don't, you're an unbelievable jerk and I can't help you. But all of us have it to one degree or another. It gets in the way of people speaking the truth to a leader. And a leader has to recognize that and take it upon herself to try and break the hold of that fear, to flatten the hill a bit, to make people comfortable to speak the truth to that leader. It's a complicated thing to do, but it comes from starting with a focus on, so what are people thinking and experiencing as they interact with me? That's how you become a good advocate, a good leader, and as I said, a good partner, I think.
Thanks so much. Ashley, as you were speaking about fear in many different ways and how we do the work we do, how we interact as leaders, or how we are led by leaders, it made me think about the next topic I wanted to discuss with you, which is security, both domestic and abroad. When you think a little bit about the landscape in security today, how would you advise young lawyers who are about to move into practice, into public service, how would you advise them to understand the kinds of domestic and foreign security threats that this country faces today?
Yeah, it's a really important question. Thank you for asking it. I should warn you, I have a pretty dark view of the world, born of life experience, but maybe I'll tell you how I speak to my own kids who are now some lawyers in law school and doing other things. I taught them to think about 3 states of the world: red, yellow, and white, and to live in yellow. And here's what I mean by those states of the world, that this is something actually the FBI teaches. At the red level, that's the level of human interaction where you're in a fight, that you are in a fight for your life. There's hormones coursing through your veins. It's a fight or flight time. It's a natural human reaction, but it's unsustainable. You can't live long-term in red. White is when we could go on the subway, you standing with your earbuds in at midnight, waiting for the T, checking your phone. That's white. That's an obliviousness to the threat around you. What I urge them to do is live in a mid-state yellow, which is an understanding of the nature of badness in the world, that it is there. And I'll talk in a second about particular threats that we face, but that it's there, but not in the red state or an orange state on the cusp of red. That's not sustainable. You can't live there. That's a recipe for stress harming your body and also just being exhausted all the time. But live with a healthy awareness. Don't stand on the T subway platform with your earbuds in, checking your phone at midnight. Look around you. The FBI used to teach people you always have 2 seconds. If you are living in yellow and something bad happens, you actually have 2 seconds to take action, which is no time at all when you're living in a state of white. It's a significant period of time when you're paying attention. And so I'm a maniac. I walk into theaters and I walk into restaurants. I always know where the exits are. I look around, see what I see. Maybe that's a little orangey of me, but I would advise people to live in a state of yellow. So why am I saying this in response to that question? Well, you should live the same way online as you would crossing a mall parking lot late at night. We have this extraordinary ability to assume that because our fingers are on our keyboard and we're in our lounge clothes, in our Zoom world, that it's somehow safer than the real world. It is the real world. There are bad people out there looking to take your money, your intellectual property, to harm your family, to take everything that matters to you and ruin it. And yet you're far less alert. You're much more likely to be in that state I described as white, than you would be if you were crossing a parking lot or standing on a subway platform. Don't let that happen to you. Live in yellow, frankly, at all times when you're outside of your house. Be aware of the potential that someone is sending you a phishing email that you're going to click on. When I worked at a company called Bridgewater, we used to test our employees and send them fake phishing emails to see if they clicked on it. And if you clicked on it, a big sign would pop up saying, "Dumbass, go report yourself to your supervisor." And it was shocking how many of my lawyers had to come report themselves to me. They were living in a state of obliviousness. Always ask, is this safe? What doesn't feel right here? Listen to those instincts. You developed instincts. You didn't. Humanity did over millennia. Listen to the hair on the back of your neck. It's telling you something meaningful. It may be wrong, but listen to that. If you're in a state of yellow, you can. So the threat. The challenge and wonder of the internet are the same thing. The wonder is we're all next door neighbors. The wonder is that Beijing and Boston are separated by microseconds because information and video images, expressions of joy and sadness are moving at 186,000 miles per second. They're moving at the speed of light. And so we're all next door neighbors. Wow, it's incredible. The bad part is we're all next door neighbors. And so people who want to take everything that means anything to you are just as close to you as if they were in the next cubicle. And they may be in environments where we can't get them through law enforcement, where it'll be very hard to get back your intellectual property, your dreams, your hopes. And so we all need to be very conscious of, celebrate the wonder of the internet, but also the danger that comes from it, is that the threat is instantaneous and the threat seems so unthreatening because you're just at your keyboard. You're not in that parking lot late at night. So I realize what a depressing speaker I am, but don't let it depress you and overwhelm you, but let yourself be aware that I'm in a world where everybody is my next door neighbor and some of them are just wonderful people. Some of them are pretty creepy pedophiles. And so let that govern the way in which you interact with the world in the real world and the digital world.
Well, that makes me think of another aspect of this issue. Over the course of your career, you've probably seen, as I have, massive changes in the sophistication, speed, and vulnerability of information. And that may be part of why it's sort of difficult for people to kind of catch up. Our senses that we have from millennia aren't necessarily attuned to this technological age we're living in. How have those changes affected you in your career and your approach to some of these issues over time?
Well, it's both a personal and a professional take on that. I have it easier than most of the people on this Zoom because I didn't grow up sharing myself in the way that you are pressured to, obligated to, socially expected to. That is, I don't really have an Instagram history. I'm still not on Facebook. there isn't stuff you could find out about me. I mean, there is plenty of stuff, but there isn't. I still am an idiot, and I've been an idiot at all different phases of my life in different idiotic ways, but there's no recording of those idiocies from my teens and my 20s. And that's a challenge that you all face, that every adversary, not just adversaries, every potential employer, every bar committee is reviewing your life to a level of granularity that wasn't possible with my life. And so I could tell stories about myself that were true, but not run into questions about, well, how does this picture of you holding a beer with something on your head at the age of 17, how is that consistent with the story you just told? So it was much easier for me coming up. Professionally, my life, especially in the law enforcement world, and even as general counsel of companies, has come to be dominated by the change I was just talking about. That because we have moved our social lives online, our financial lives online, our health lives online, our education lives, everything has been moved online. That brings us to the wonderful and the terrible. We connect in ways we couldn't before, we see in ways we couldn't before, but we're vulnerable in ways that we weren't before. And I try to explain inside the FBI that the FBI was actually really born 100 years ago in the wake after the last great pandemic. As part of that extraordinary growth of the 1920s, America changed in so many ways. But one of the ways was that the automobile started to become ubiquitous. And suddenly criminals could move at unbelievable speeds over distances that were unimaginable. They could rob a bank in Illinois and Indiana in the same day, moving at like 45, 50 miles an hour. Holy cow. Well, the challenge that posed for the way in which we thought about public safety in the United States was all of a sudden the county sheriff and even state police are outgunned, outsped. They can't catch up with these vehicles. And once somebody crosses a county line or a state line, we're in Illinois, how are we gonna do something in Indiana? How will that work? And a national response was needed. And there was J. Edgar Hoover, the first director. I was the seventh. The first director of the FBI was there with a TV camera, well, film camera, and this idea that the answer to this problem is the FBI, because we'll be national. We can span jurisdictional lines and chase these criminals who are moving at breathtaking speeds. Okay, so fast forward 100 years. Well, the threat isn't moving at a 45, 50 miles an hour between Indiana and Illinois. It's moving at the speed of light across the entire globe. It's in Belarus, it's in Beijing, it's in Buenos Aires, it's in Boston. Maybe it's in all of those places at the same time. How do you deal with a threat like that? And the real challenge for the FBI that I was trying to help us find our way out of was, we didn't respond in the 1920s by establishing a car division at headquarters. Instead, what we did was we bought cars and we taught all the agents in the field to drive the cars. The Bureau responded to the big changes with the explosion of internet communications and all of us participating in online lives. We responded mostly by establishing a cyber division at headquarters. Well, in my view, that's not going to work for the long run, because that's like establishing a car division at headquarters. Instead, what we have to do is develop the expertise in our people and in our technology, and then push that out, not just across America, but across the world, to be able to respond to this threat. That challenge was one that was going to dominate my 10 years as FBI director, and I got fired in my 4th year. And so I never got a chance to finish the swing on that, but that is going to dominate the FBI's life now and the life of companies. Anybody who's doing any work that touches the internet, which is all of us, has to grapple with the fact that the threat has changed in ways that are also unimaginable. And finding ways to protect your infrastructure, your systems, and your people is at the heart of every institution, whether you're government or private.
Well, let's move on to thinking a little bit about your time at the FBI and thinking about the FBI and the government. So you talked a lot about its early development and how that responded to critical changes in the society that were occurring early in the 20th century. Another critical change we're seeing in our society is a new concern and new emphasis on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I wonder how much geographic, ethnic, linguistic, racial diversity did you see, or how much of a change did you see during your time in the FBI? And you know, how would you think about those issues going forward for the FBI?
Yeah, it's maybe the most important issue I faced. Actually, it is the most important issue I faced at the FBI. The FBI, when I became director in 2013, was immensely better than it was before 9/11 in terms of the quality of the people that have been attracted to the work by national emergency, the breadth of skills, its language abilities, and its diversity in all respects except one very, very important respect, which I'll come to in a second. And that the FBI had learned that to keep America safe, it has to be forward deployed. The FBI doesn't have arrest powers overseas. It isn't in the spying business. But if you're going to protect America, you have to have relationships with local federal law enforcement all around the world so you can share information to them and you can get information from them and bring it back. And so the FBI then developed close to 100 offices around the world in order to be that. So the Bureau was unrecognizable to those maybe who'd gone to, who'd slipped into a slumber in the late 90s and woken up in 2013, except in one incredibly important way, it had gone in the opposite direction. For over a decade, the institution's special agents, about a third of its workforce, had started with the iconic third, the famous third, had become steadily but consistently more white, non-Hispanic, Caucasian. By the time I became director, the percentage had grown to 83% of the special agents of the FBI were white. And the number of female special agents was stuck below 20%. It bounced between 18 and 20%. And when I became director, I saw those statistics and they shocked me. I had assumed that after 9/11, we had attracted to the work a broad spectrum of Americans. So as America changed, the FBI was changing, and actually the opposite was happening. And I wrote to the whole workforce and said, this is an emergency. This is a crisis. First of all, there's a moral imperative. We have to attract more people of color, more women to be part of this. But there's also an effectiveness imperative. As the country grows more complicated, more diverse, in my view, more wonderful, we, to be effective, have to look more like America. If we're going to be able to speak to America, represent America, help America, it doesn't help if everybody looks like me. And so we set about to change the FBI in significant ways. And I focused on this, I was going to say every day, it's not an exaggeration, every day for 4 years, because I knew it would take a decade of work, and I had a decade's term to try to meaningfully change the way in which it worked. Now, the cool thing was, there was plenty of talent out there. It's just that not enough women and people of color knew that they ought to be part of the FBI and absorb the stress and low pay and risk their lives to be part of this. But once they decided to be part of this, almost nobody left, because they became addicted to the work, to trying to do good for other people. And they recognized the kind of family that this was. They just didn't know us well enough yet. But there was one respect in which I knew they knew us. And I also talked to the organization about this as we thought about trying to attract more Black special agents. I said, you may not know the history of the FBI, but I guarantee you, everybody we would like to recruit to come here understands the history of the FBI and its intersection with Black America, especially what we did in the 1960s to the civil rights leadership, especially what we did to Dr. Martin Luther King. And we need to own that and stare at it and make it clear to them that we own that history, that we know that history, we will never forget that history. And so at my direction, we created a curriculum where every new special agent and intelligence analyst took a class to study that history, and then came to Washington and visited the King Memorial, which I hope all of you will visit. It's an incredible thing on the banks of the Potomac Basin in a dead line between Jefferson and Lincoln. You see this king emerging from the Stone of Hope from the Mountain of Despair. And we asked them to pick one of the quotations on the 2 arcs of stone on either side of the statue, 16 quotations, and write an essay. How does that intersect with the FBI's values? And the cool thing about this was, we didn't tell them how to think. We just said 2 things must be true. You must know the FBI's history, and you must think. You must think in terms of values. And it was, and I believe still is, one of the most popular things in the FBI training curriculum. We did that because we wanted to be better, but we also did it so we would send a signal to the people we were hoping to attract. We understand our history. We're not covering it up. We're going to be honest about it. We need you to make us better. And the day I got fired, learned on television I was fired, I was in Los Angeles that night to meet with about 700 engineers, MBAs, JDs of color to pitch them. Because I discovered that when we talked to people in a room, we'd walk out of there with half or a third of them wanting to be special agents. And I was there that night to do the mother of all of our pitches to a huge group in Southern California, and got fired on television before I could get there. But this consumed me at the FBI, again, because it's the right thing to do, but also because it's a threat to that institution. And one of the challenges of the Trump era is, I think it was very hard for people of color, especially Black Americans who would be thinking about becoming special agents, to step into the organization. I'm hopeful that, freed from a racist president, the current director, my successor, can once again speak about that institution, and in a good way. And I wrote in my book, and nobody in the press picked up on it, unfortunately, that I think they ought to strip Hoover's name off the building and name it in favor of John Lewis, to send a signal to the FBI and to all of American law enforcement that we must know history if we are going to change the future. So I'm sorry to talk about this so long, but this is a really important thing for the FBI and for law enforcement in general.
No, that was really very powerful to hear. Thank you. And you've spoken at length about pivotal moments in institutions like the FBI and the Department of Justice. And I guess maybe as a final question in this part of our conversation, are we in the midst of another pivotal moment for these institutions, and how would you describe it? What are the challenges? What are the opportunities?
Yeah, I think we are at an inflection point. They don't come along that often. This one is, as I think in general for America and the world, that we're at a point where we're going to see extraordinary growth. There are two challenges for the new leadership of the Department of Justice and for the current leadership of the FBI. One easy, one hard. The easy one is unlock what's written on the hearts of the people who work there. I mean, the core values of the FBI, there's no deep state, but there are deep values that go into bedrock. Apolitical, nonpartisan law enforcement is written on the hearts of everybody who works there. They don't want to be part of anybody's political tribe. In fact, to the extent we had problems, it was to try and avoid that polarizing tribalness. And so the easy part's just going to be let people be what they are. They haven't changed. The 4 years of the Trump administration weren't long enough to change in any significant way the people of those institutions. They've grown those values in the 50 years since Watergate, the last time that the institutions needed saving. After 50 years, those things run deep. So they'll be unlocked pretty quickly, and talent will flow back to the extent that people left. The harder part of the inflection point is going to be to lead Americans out of the fog. There are millions of Americans who believe that COVID was a hoax, that they don't need a mask, that the election was stolen, and then obviously closer to my life experience, that the FBI is part of the deep state, and that Comey was the leader of the deep state, part of some deep state coup effort that I actually can't fully explain to you because it makes no sense, but who believe there was a coup effort led by the FBI and the institution is a corrupt part of the deep state. Now, why do people believe these things? Because they were told those things by the President of the United States, echoed thousands and thousands of times, but spoken by the President of the United States. I mean, it's a healthy part of a democracy that when the president tells the country something, people tend to believe the president. In normal times, that's good, unless your president's a lying sociopath. And so people internalize those things, believe those things. I have in-laws in Iowa who believed a lot of those things. So what do you do about that? You do not help people emerge from a fog of fraud, of lies, by shouting at them, by telling them they're idiots. I've done fraud cases where the victims of the fraud showed up at the sentencing to defend the fraudster after the fraudster had pled guilty. They were slower than the criminal himself to admit it was a fraud. Now, why is that? Because it's so hard to admit you're wrong about anything. Maybe you all are different than I am, but it's hard for me to admit I'm wrong. It's especially hard to admit you're wrong when you've been defrauded, when you've been fooled, because it's just achingly painful to admit that you were duped. And so people only emerge from a fog of fraud by finding a way for themselves out of that fog, finding a story they can tell themselves. It isn't by being yelled at. That just puts them deeper in the fog. And so the mission for the new president, for the new leaders of the Department of Justice, is to help people escape that fog, to show them what empathetic, competent, honest leadership looks like. And that will help them, not all of them, we're going to have all kinds of wingnuts in this country that we can talk about if you want, but the people, my in-laws, my wife's extended family, who are not bad people, they just have been lied to in a way that they believed, help them emerge from that fog, help them realize that what they were told about the deep state and all that, it wasn't true, and find their way out of that. That takes a long time, and that's about effective leadership showing what good looks like. And I think you're starting to see it in this country. I'm starting to feel it, but that's a process that takes a period of years.
Let's shift to some of the questions that came in from our audience before the program as they registered. And then at the end of the program today, we'll have a few minutes to get to some questions that have come from people currently watching. So I'm combining a couple of questions, but this seems to be a pretty important theme in the question. So we know that extraordinary political pressure can be placed upon agencies like the DOJ, the FBI, and the CIA, and that can be it can be very damaging. And then I guess if we think about it personally in terms of our students perhaps entering into these agencies as professionals or as leaders, how do you balance carrying out the political goals of an administration that you serve with what you might feel is morally and ethically right? In other words, you will be drawn into, as you have been, battles that actually for you have some clear moral guidelines, but you also have responsibilities to run your agency or to work within your agency. How do you deal with that?
Yeah, that's a great one. That's really hard. I think the best thing to do is constantly remember, make sure you know what you stand for and what the core values of the institution that you represent or lead or participate in, what those are. And constantly measure what you're being asked to do against those North Stars. And an aid for that is always travel to the future. That's another cool thing you're learning in law school, is you're being forced to time travel. I can remember this in law school, being asked a question and giving what I thought was a pretty good answer, and then being asked, well, what if that same question was asked of you in the Lochner era? And I can't even remember what the Lochner era was. I just know the term, and it gives me shivers. But what would the answer be like then? Or what if the law evolves in this way? What would you say the answer would be 25 years from now if the court moves in the following directions? Okay, that's a nightmare. But what it's forcing you to do is travel in time and see a situation in a different place in time, how others might see it. And so one of the things that's really useful to you as you get in situations that are professional, that are making the hair stand up on the back of your neck, travel. Travel to the future in a quiet room and imagine yourself explaining this decision you're being asked to make or this initiative you're being asked to participate in to your family, to a class of sixth graders that you're somehow visiting, to a law school class you're teaching, but go to the future and explain it to them. Because what that will do is force you to figure out the connection to those higher values, right? Because that's the way you're going to tell the story. We did this thing, and here's why it made sense, and here's why it's something that I think was the right thing to do. Do that now, in the moment, and it will help you make better decisions. And you need to just decide, once you've done that exercise, you need to decide, am I comfortable here? Given what I believe my own values are, given what I believe this institution's values are, what am I comfortable with? There may be some things you decide, I need to advocate for a little more aggressively and see if I can't get it to a healthier place. There may be other things where you say, no, not only no, but hell no. This is not me, this is not who I am. Now, I'm not a fool. People have all kinds of financial obligations. So I'm not suggesting you go running out of the building screaming, screw you all. But you need to decide, so given my obligations to others, to children who need to be fed, to old relatives who need to be supported, and the conflict with my values, what should I do? Should I ask to be transferred? Should I leave immediately? Can I wait this out? Can I advocate more aggressively? But again, always lifting your eyes and traveling with those lifted eyes in mind to help you illuminate this current situation that you're in. And I'll shut up in a second, but take Donald Trump. I knew the kind of person Donald Trump was. And I could tell from the beginning this was going to be very difficult. The man wanted a pledge of loyalty from me, the director of the FBI, the leader of an institution that the American people do not want to be the personal investigative force of the President of the United States. That much the American people have made crystal clear since Watergate. And he's trying to compromise that. So how should I think about that? And my view was, I should be willing to bend a little bit so that I don't bend in a way that compromises either me or my institution. So I'll do things like, when we have an awkward conversation, he wants loyalty and I refuse it, and then he wants honest loyalty, and I say, yeah, that you'll get from me. What am I doing? I'm bending. But I'm telling myself a story that I think was a true story, that I'm not bending too much, that I'm bending in a way that serves the longer term interests, mine and the institutions. And that if I tell this guy to go screw and get fired now, what happens to the FBI? What will happen to that institution if an amoral person immediately gets rid of me? So no, I'm going to bend a little bit. There's a danger I'm talking myself into my own virtue here, is always the case. But I think I got that right. What I couldn't see clearly at that point was, even my little bends, I was done. It was never going to work between the two of us. We were just too different. But that's how I thought about it. I constantly asked, so what compromises am I being asked to make? And why do those make sense in light of those things, the things above?
Thank you. Something we're all more aware of now, and something that actually, one of the few things that seems to garner agreement across the political divide, is that the country faces new and serious threats from China and from Russia. How could we better protect ourselves, our infrastructure, and our industry from economic espionage threats from those countries and other types of threats that they may pose?
Yeah, another great one and really hard one. First of all, they're two different threats. They both come at us through fiber optic cable. They're coming at us in the digital world, but I think of them slightly differently. China is rising in extraordinary ways, and the world is going to be very different 100 years from now as China continues its growth. And so the two nations, the two great powers, are going to bump against each other throughout your lifetimes in ways I hope will be manageable and avoid bloodshed, but they're going to bang against each other. And we see the world in very, very different ways. To come back to what I said at the beginning about other people experiencing the world differently. One of the real challenges I had in my conversations with my Chinese counterparts was that they struggled to accept our framework, Western American framework of public-private. They struggled to accept what I said, which is, look, it's fine for you to try and steal our secrets, right? That's espionage. That's what nation states have done as long as they were nation states. We'll try and stop you. You'll try and steal stuff from us. We'll try and steal stuff from you. That's statecraft. It's not okay for you to steal our intellectual property to make money, to steal paint formulas, to steal the designs of automobiles, to steal medicines. That's not okay. The challenge of communicating about that framework with the Chinese was they don't see it. They saw it as one. They saw it as the people. And whether they were stealing the designs of a jet aircraft or house paint, it was all in service to the same entity, the People's Republic of China. And so one of our struggles was to get them to understand that framework, that we were focused on stopping them from ordinary theft. You're going to constantly have those disconnects with the Chinese as they rise. And so what you're going to have to do is figure out the activity that we see, which is it? Is it what we would consider statecraft, or is it criminal theft? And then decide upon your reactions given that classification, and then think about the nature of the attack. Is it one that's more akin to an act of war, that we need something closer to a kinetic response, a physical response? Should we be arresting people? Those sorts of things. But it's not going to go away as the two nations become the two dominant presences on the earth. The Russians are very different because Russia is shrinking and struggling and is not a commercial threat to the United States. Russia's engaged in statecraft, which includes manipulation, efforts to shape our democracy, but they're not stealing stuff to try, in the main, to steal money. And so when you see Russian activity, it's almost all aimed at their national objectives for security, for thwarting what they see as threats to their internal order, those sorts of things. They're very sophisticated in their threat, but it's much narrower, deep hole than the Chinese threat, which is gigantic and multidimensional. So what do you do about this? Live in yellow. And do one other thing, and I'll shut up, is realize that if you you're in charge of security for an enterprise, do not kid yourself that you've solved the problem with great technology, with great patch management and intrusion detection, and we have the best of this and that, because you still got people. And the weak link is always the people in your organization, the people in your supply chain, because some knucklehead today is picking up a thumb drive that he found next to his parking space in the parking lot, and because it's free, sticking it into his work computer, or he's clicking on a phishing email or doing something else that doesn't make any sense. And then the bad guys are in your house. And so the smartest institutions I know combine the two. They don't have somebody in charge of cyber, somebody in charge of human resources security. It has to be together if you're going to be safe against a threat that's coming at you in all different kinds of ways.
Thanks. I'm going to ask one more question that came to us early, and then after this question, I'll hand it back to the students who will curate some questions that have come in from the audience. So as a final question, what role do you think civil society or organizations of civil society like local nonprofits, faith organizations, and some others could play in curtailing the current wave of domestic terrorism, or in helping institutions of justice rebuild their credibility, or even just holding folks accountable?
I think they have an essential role, maybe less of a question of accountability, which in the way I think about it has to be with enforcement, judicial institutions. But I think civil society plays a vital role in two respects. And I separate the challenge that we have now with white supremacy. I'm not sure right and left wing makes sense in America anymore, but white supremacy motivated violence. You think Proud Boys, think 3%ers, that crowd, but it's a much more complicated group than that. And then think about the challenges that we have with communities of color, but I worry that the importance of this gets lost if I use that term, in the Black community's intersection with uniform law enforcement. Those are two very different problems, challenges. They both involve the same answer, which is all institutions of society participating in connection. With respect to the crowd in the sort of the white supremacist end of the swimming pool, I would say there's a vital role for civil society to play in de-radicalizing. Now, a lot of these folks we just got to lock up. That's not what I'm talking about, but I'm talking about the people in the fog of fraud who've been radicalized, almost in the way that we see Islamist terrorist organizations radicalizing, very similar, radicalizing to believe they're on the side of the angels based on lies. Everyone participating and helping those people move out of that fog of fraud is vital to us being a healthier country. Of longer standing, no less important, and maybe even more important, is the perennial separation between uniform law enforcement and the Black community in most parts of America. Those two lines have always been apart, but they've been arcing farther and farther apart over the last 10 years for reasons that all of us, I hope, know and understand. There's no simple answer to arcing the line back together, except a laborious effort of getting up close. I taught at Howard University for a year right after I got fired. And Howard has a course that I wish could be replicated all across the country called Policing Inside Out, taught by a professor named Binyan Muhammad. And she teaches a class that's 30 students, 15 Howard undergrads, 15 active duty big city law enforcement, cops, uniform cops. They spend a semester together. And just the body language tells the story of the class. Beginning of the semester, they sit on opposite sides of the room. By the time the semester's over, and they've been assigned to see the world through the eyes of the other, paired up, so that the cop is required to experience life as best he possibly can through the eyes of a 19-year-old Black young man in Baltimore or Chicago, see the world through those eyes, especially see law enforcement. And that 19-year-old has been required to see the life of a law enforcement officer through the windshield at 2 o'clock in the morning. By the time they've invested in that work, they're inseparable. Well, in a way, that's the answer. Getting up close to each other. It's very hard to hate up close. And so I think institutions of civil society have an opportunity to bring people close together so law enforcement understands how they are perceived, their shortfalls, and the community comes to better understand what law enforcement needs and fears. And together the lines start to arc closer and closer together. This can't be scaled. It's not done in social media. It's not done with slick brochures. It's done by people investing in the hard work, the time to sit together and try and see the world through the eyes of another. In a way, that's the answer to both of those very, very different problems, but that's the best I can think of.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to pass it now to our student leaders and let them curate a few more questions for you before we close.
Hi, Director Comey. Thank you so much for all of your very interesting and timely responses to our questions. I have a few questions from audience members. In your book, you talk a lot about Gerald Ford's selection of Edward Levy to the head of the DOJ and how he was exactly what the country needed after Nixon. Do you think that Merrick Garland fits this same role? And are you pleased with President Biden's pick?
I do. I think I don't know Merrick Garland except by reputation. I think he is exactly the kind of person that the country needed right now. Somebody apart from politics, not identified with either political tribe, hasn't participated in political activity, spoken at conventions. It's coming from the judges bench. The president of the University of Chicago, Ed Levy, who actually was my first year law professor, was just that kind of person. He had been outside of politics. People couldn't figure out what his politics were when he was appointed Attorney General, and they didn't know when he left, because what he did was he came and represented the idea of justice, because the idea of justice doesn't belong to Republicans or Democrats or anyone else. It's about nonpartisan law enforcement, and he represented that in a great way. So I think it's a great pick. I hope Merrick Garland will get out there. Ed Levy traveled all around the country, gave lots of speeches, which was cool in the 1970s, I guess, but we don't get our information anymore through speeches at bar associations or things. Some of us do, I guess, but we consume information in a different way. And so I hope he'll look for ways to radiate the values of that institution in different ways. I'm not suggesting he has to go on The View or something, but he has to communicate and show justice, what it really is to the American people.
Great. Thank you so much for that insight. Going back to the conversation we were just having about race, I know America is currently using today as a form of reflection on our history surrounding race. With that, as young adults who are part of this new voting generation and a lot of law students here today, what are some ways that we can use our education and passions to take action towards the changes we want to see?
Oh, well, I can think of some. You'll think of more. First, just the question. You ought to be asking the question exactly that way. How do I make things better? And then I have some suggestions. First, participate in the life of this country. And I became a prosecutor, really important work. You don't have to be a prosecutor. Participate as a defense lawyer, participate as a court-appointed guardian ad litem, participate using the skills you've had, the credential you will have as a law school graduate to make us better, to get us up close to each other, to find ways to achieve justice. One of my kids is a police officer. He's the only philosophy major of his elite liberal arts college, I think, to become a police officer. He became a police officer because he said, look, Dad, I'm in good shape and I want to help people. I can't think of a better way to help them. He is exactly, of course, I'm so biased, I'm his dad, but he is a great cop. He's exactly what you would want as a police officer. We need to attract people like that to that kind of work and find ways to see each other more clearly. A so-called progressive prosecutor was elected defeating the incumbent in his jurisdiction, in his city. And he told me that a lot of the other cops are upset that the incumbent, the woman who'd been the incumbent for a long time, lost, and she was replaced by a so-called progressive prosecutor. And his reaction was, it's actually kind of cool because she's seeing things in different ways and we'll see whether it works or not. And she's made changes that make sense. She's made changes to bail, how we think about cash bail, that he thinks makes sense. He can't stand writing tickets to people at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning that are going to bankrupt them, that are going to drive them to a place where they can't pay the ticket. And so they're going to reform how they think about traffic enforcement. Very exciting. All of you can find a role to participate in there. Defense lawyer, prosecutor, volunteer, but use what you have to make us better. It's a really cool time.
Thank you for that answer. Kind of going off of that and some topics that you discussed earlier, we have a question here about how do you see the future evolving for women in the FBI, and when do you think we'll have a female director of the Bureau?
That's a great one. I hope next, but it's going to be a challenge because the FBI's culture is heavily centered in a way nobody talks about, not just on white men, but on men. It's a male-dominated culture. And I spent a lot of time talking to women in leadership and made a couple of dumb mistakes early on. I traveled all around to all 56 field offices, and I did breakout groups when I first started to try and hear, so what do you need me to do? And I arranged breakout groups just of the women agents, in some places women leaders, and they asked me not to do that anymore because they said that singles us out in a way that's problematic in this culture. You got to find ways to communicate with us, but do it in secret. Whoa, I learned a lot just from that ask. And so it's a male-dominated culture. And one of the things they told me is to be successful, they have to act male in a lot of ways. That the way they dress, the way they carry themselves, the way they talk. And I know I both respect and fear culture and know how hard it is to change human culture in a big institution, especially a 100-year-old institution. So I think it's going to be a long journey for the FBI to slowly change its culture to be less male-dominated. True of all law enforcement, I think, the FBI being part of that. And so I think it will be really good to have a female FBI director to move that, but she'll have a tough time. It'll be a tough time because culture is best defined as the way they really do things around here, no matter what they tell you in the training. And so how do you shape culture? And she'll have to find ways to do it without getting to a place where the institution tries to shut her out and leave her behind. And because I'm a white male, I don't have great advice on how to navigate that, but it's something to think about. But it's all the more reason to try and put in place at the FBI someone who can represent a different approach and help lead a different approach. But that's a really hard question.
And then we have a question about when you were the U.S. attorney in New York, you talked about the chicken shit club and the need to take risks. Lawyers tend to be risk-averse people. Can you talk about some of the risks you took in your career and how to decide when to take those risks?
Yeah, I guess this is being taped, so it's a peril of me sometimes being candid on tape. I said the word chicken shit out loud. Now I'm stuck with it. What I used to do was I feared that a prosecutor's office culture was drifting to a place when I became U.S. Attorney in New York where losing was a badge of dishonor. And the reason I feared that so much is if winning is everything in a prosecutor's office, you risk some really bad things happening. Because some of the most important things that happen in a prosecutor's office happen on quiet weekend afternoons when the prosecutor is going through her files and has to decide what information to turn over to the defense. And when she's deciding whether to hand over a piece of information that's marginal, but it could really hurt her case and she's struggling with, I needed her to hear my voice in her head. And my voice would be there saying, I don't care about winning and losing. I care about justice. Your client is an idea. And so if you have to spend a moment thinking about whether you ought to disclose this, you ought to disclose this. And the danger to that mindset of a culture where losing was feared or where being undefeated was celebrating is that the voice you would hear on that Saturday afternoon would be, we don't lose. Oh, we don't lose. Boss doesn't want us to lose. And so I took to thinking about, so when people tell me that they're 38-0 as a prosecutor, first, I worry about the kind of culture they're part of. And second, I also wonder whether they're a chicken shit. Because I don't know a prosecutor who's never lost a count, never lost a defendant in a case, because sometimes the cause is just. and you have to bring a case. Right? My daughter was prosecuting Jeffrey Epstein in New York before he killed himself. And now she's prosecuting a woman named Ghislaine Maxwell. It's a hard case. I am really proud of her for bringing that case. It's going to be a challenge. She's working her butt off. It's the right thing to do. Even if she lost that case, it's the right thing to do. And so you want to make sure you create a culture in a prosecutor's office. We not only don't fear losing, you embrace the idea that sometimes we have to do the right thing. Now, as you make decisions about cases, know that only a terrible advocate can't convince himself of his own righteousness. And so know the danger of falling in love with your own view of things, but taking that into account, scrubbing your facts, scrubbing your assumptions. If your cause is just, there are times when you have to give it your best shot, even if you won't meet the, which I think appropriately high bar of proving guilt beyond a reasonable doubt to a jury of 12 who must agree unanimously. And so when I talked about chicken shits, I was trying to, in a very short form way, capture that much more complicated notion. And I kind of wish I hadn't used the word chicken shit.
Thank you. We're going to ask 2 more questions. We're going to try and be respectful of your time here. I know this is running a bit long. This question is from one of our professors who's also a veteran of the Department of Justice. And he asks, what role should federal criminal justice play and not play on the global stage? Is there a risk that, for example, indicting President Moderna or Chinese COVID-19 vaccine hackers will needlessly embroil the US in tricky foreign policy situations?
Yeah, you figures a professor would ask a hard question like that. It's one of the only circumstances in which it's appropriate, in my view, for the executive branch leadership to participate in decisions about criminal prosecutions. I write in my book that unless it involves national security, foreign policy implications, a president, a White House should have nothing to do with an individual case. They can talk about cases, priorities, but not an individual case, because that's the path to Lady Justice's blindfold coming off. But in circumstances where the national interest would be affected in some meaningful way by the charging decisions, it's legitimate and important that you consider broadly those things. When I was an AUSA in Richmond, Virginia, I wanted to indict a case involving the attack on a US Air Force barracks in Saudi Arabia, where 19 US airmen were killed and hundreds wounded. And the evidence showed that the government of Iran had funded it. It was an attack carried out by Hezbollah, the Party of God, but that it was a terrorist group, but it was funded and supported by Iran. I wanted to say that in the indictment. And so I was summoned to the White House to explain that to the National Security Council and why. And they asked probing questions and wanted to know, because my decision to ask the grand jury to accuse Iran of killing Americans who had significant foreign policy implications, totally legitimate. As with the cyber cases that have been brought against the Chinese, for example, or the Russians recently, I assume, I don't think there was a lot of careful deliberation of the Trump White House, but I hope at least some level in the Trump White House, they had a chance to weigh in on those decisions because of the implications. We ought not to be in a situation where prosecutors wall off those considerations, because that's a path for them not acting in the interest of our country by having too narrow a view of things.
Great, thank you so much. And our last question is, just to kind of tie everything together, how do you handle the public sometimes failing to understand some of your values and decisions? And how do you balance a career in public service with the negative backlash that such a career can create?
Are you suggesting that people have criticized me? I didn't see that.
No.
What do? You care, but you can't care too much. Right? Luckily, I was raised by parents who constantly preached, doesn't matter what the crowd says, doesn't matter what the crowd says, you stand up and be counted, which is great, but you do care a little bit what the crowd says. And so I've had to make decisions that a lot of smart people of goodwill don't understand and are still pissed at me about. I can't explain to all of them the basis for the decisions. When I have time to explain it to people, they almost all walk away saying, oh man, wow, I had no idea. Wow, you were screwed. But here's how I think about it. Open the window to public opinion and criticism a little bit, just a crack. because if you open it too much, it's going to overwhelm you. It's why I don't read Twitter comments, right? That's opening the window too big. But don't close it, because through that crack might come useful criticism, might come perspectives you didn't think of, facts that hadn't occurred to you, takes that are important to you. And so I open the window a crack to try and let in thoughtful voices. Now, how do I find thoughtful voices? By virtue of their position, their reputation, the organization they're writing for, sometimes just the logic of their presentation. I think, oh, okay, that's useful to know. But you can't open it too far, because there's so much out there that it's just not useful to you, and it will beat you down. Now, what helps me is I'm surrounded by a resilient family who knows me for the fool that I am and understands my decisions. And they're the people I really care about most. And I care what they think of and how they think about me. The rest, I'd be lying if I said I don't care about public opinion, but I don't care that much. And maybe if I was a politician, if I wanted to run for office or something, that has to become your life, but I'm not. I never intended to run for office. I'm not going to now. And so I keep the window on a crack and secretly hope that people will, if they care enough, dig into it. You really care about the decisions I made around Hillary Clinton's emails, dig into it. I suspect you'll walk away like, oh man, that was harder than I thought. That's how I approach it.
Well, I appreciate all that, Director Comey. And once again, as we close out here, thank you, Dean Rougeau, for moderating this event for us. Thank you, of course, to the director. Thank you to Nate Kenyon for facilitating this whole thing. And to the audience members, of course, thank you for your attendance. Our attendance numbers were humbling, and I was proud to see that we were able to engage and provide at least a little bit of value for some of you on your day off. To those of you whose questions, either pre-registered or otherwise, were not answered or addressed in the time that we had, we'll be sending out both another thank you email, but also a chance to give some feedback. And to the extent that some of you have been part of our open debate series that we've conducted with Professor Coe, we invite you to let us know if those are questions that you'd like to revisit on a forum amongst us students, maybe with some other professors involved. I don't like to have questions go unanswered if I can avoid them. But anyway, thanks again. We'll be on for a few minutes just talking amongst ourselves, but this concludes our webinar. Again, thank you to all participants and panelists.